So can you see my desktop? Good. So then let's start. Let me see if I can do something better. Okay, doesn't look like, okay. Okay, so you can see my screen, right? Good. So the first thing today is we'll cover the synaptic transmission. You know, the synapse is a junction where one neuron ends and another neuron begins. So you can see this is a neuron here, and this is the end of this neuron, and this is the beginning of this neuron. So this part of this neuron is communicating involved in a junction with this neuron. So the neuron that is, we call this one a presynaptic neuron, and this one we call postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and that junction between those two, we call it synaptic, synapse. Okay, synapse. Now look at this one here. If we enlarge this area, this is the presynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic neuron. So a few of the features in the presynaptic neuron that I want to highlight you. Here you can see some synaptic vesicle here, which contain some neurotransmitters. Okay. So when an action potential travels through the presynaptic neuron and it arrives the presynaptic terminal, what happened is that a few things happen. Let me tell you the most important event that happens. So the synaptic vesicles that you have in the presynaptic neuron, they are fused to the presynaptic membrane and they release their content, which is the neurotransmitter. And the process by which they release the neurotransmitter into synaptic cleft, which is the gap between the two neurons. So that process is called, that is a chemical process, and the neurotransmitter is released into the synaptic cleft by a process called exocytosis. You are familiar with exocytosis, right? When cell release something, that process is called exocytosis. Okay. So when a signal reaches the presynaptic terminal, the synaptic vesicle, they come and fuse with the presynaptic membrane, and they release their content, which is neurotransmitter, by the process called uh, exocytosis. And this is a gap between the two neurons, because at the junction, two neurons are not anatomically continuous. They are not structurally continuous. There is a small gap between them. The gap between two neurons at the junction is called synaptic cleft. This is the drawing actually, so this is exaggerated. So this gap is very small actually, very few, only few micrometers. So that is the gap called synaptic cleft. Now this, as they are not anatomically continuous, we need a process for the signal to be transmitted from this one, presynaptic neuron, to postsynaptic neuron. So the process of transfer of signal from presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron is called synaptic transmission. And because as it is mediated through the neurotransmitter, which are chemicals, we call it a chemical transmission. Okay, so now the synaptic, the neurotransmitter there, which are released on the synaptic cleft, they bind to the receptors that are located in the postsynaptic membrane. So this is the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so on the postsynaptic membrane, there are receptors, and then neurotransmitter bind to the receptors and elicit a response in the postsynaptic neuron. Now, what type of response they will elicit, that depends on what type of neurotransmitter is released from the presynaptic neuron. Okay, so if it is an, we call, there are two type of, we divide them into two major types, the excitatory neurotransmitter and the inhibitory neurotransmitter. One common example of excitatory neurotransmitter, is most common one, is acetylcholine. Okay, and one of the very common example of inhibitory neurotransmitter is, like, say, called glycine. Okay, now if the neurotransmitter that is released here is acetylcholine, that will bind to the postsynaptic receptors in the postsynaptic membrane and will depolarize this membrane. So action potential will now be transmitted from this one to this one, and then it will go to the end of this neuron. But now, when you stimulate the presynaptic neuron, if it release glycine in this synapse, what will happen? Glycine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that will bind to the specific receptors present in the postsynaptic membrane, and it will actually inhibit the membrane. So there will be no depolarization on the postsynaptic membrane, which means this signal will not travel any further because this is inhibited at this junction, at this synapse. Okay, so let's go into a little bit of detail of this one. So if we go to this one, now look at what happened. This is the presynaptic terminal, and this is the postsynaptic membrane, right? Now, if you look what happens, so when an action potential reaches the presynaptic membrane, the first thing that happens is that the calcium ion get into the presynaptic membrane from the extracellular fluid. Okay, so calcium get in, and in response to the calcium, these neurotransmitter containing vesicles, they move towards the presynaptic membrane. They eventually get fused and then release their neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. Okay, so that is one of the important aspects that I didn't mention with the previous slide. Now, if we go by step, what happens? So where is this neurotransmitter coming from in the vesicle? Neurotransmitters are synthesized within the presynaptic terminal, okay, or in the soma of the cell body from the precursors. Now, precursors depend on what neurotransmitter you are synthesizing. For an example, say if it is an acetylcholine, then you need acetate and choline, and those precursors under the influence of an enzyme will be converted into acetylcholine, right? Now, if it is a adrenergic neuron, the neurotransmitter will be norepinephrine. In that case, your precursor will be tyrosine, which is an amino acid, right? So eventually, by the enzymatic action, tyrosine will eventually be converted into, oh, this is hiding this one. The tyrosine will be converted into norepinephrine. So which neurotransmitter will be stored in the synaptic vesicle, that will depend on what type of nerve it is. Okay, so now first thing is that the precursor substance that are required for the synthesis of neurotransmitter will be taken up by the presynaptic terminal. By the enzymatic action, they will be converted into neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters will be stored into the synaptic vesicle in the presynaptic neuron, right? In the synaptic vesicle. Now, they will be stored here in the synaptic vesicle until an action potential arrives here. So when an action potential arrives here, calcium ion will go in to the presynaptic terminal, and that will cause the binding of the synaptic vesicle to the presynaptic membrane. Okay, and the next stage, on the stage 4, this neurotransmitter will be released into the synaptic cleft. Okay, so now you can see the neurotransmitter is released in the synaptic cleft. Next, what will happen? This neurotransmitter that is released from the vesicle, they will bind to the postsynaptic membrane. Here, look at here. This is the receptor in the postsynaptic membrane, which is the receptor, and the neurotransmitter will be bound to this one, and it will elicit a response. Now, what type of response will it be? That depends on what type of neurotransmitter is being released. Okay. Okay. Now, so that is up to response. Now, we don't want actually to neurotransmitter to be present in the synaptic cleft for a long time and keep doing things. Okay. We want to have a quick response, and then we want to terminate that response, right? After some time, we don't want that response to continue. We want a termination of that response. So how this action will be terminated? If we move to the next slide, you can see some of the neurotransmitter. If the neurotransmitter stays in the synaptic cleft, they will bind to the postsynaptic membrane, and they will keep producing response, right? That's not what we want. We want a quick response and then the termination of response. So how the response will be terminated? The neurotransmitter that were released, some of them will be uptaken back into the presynaptic membrane, which means you are removing the neurotransmitter from the area so that it will not work anymore. So how the neurotransmitters work will be stopped by taking up some of the neurotransmitter back to the presynaptic terminal. We call this a reuptake. Oh, okay, uptaken by the presynaptic membrane. Another thing that can happen is that some of the neurotransmitters that are released in the synaptic cleft, instead of being reuptaken, they will diffuse away from the area so that they will not work anymore, or some of them they will be metabolized by enzymes. Okay, so like acetylcholine was released here. If you reuptake some of the acetylcholine, you don't have any acetylcholine here, but there is a specific enzyme called cholinesterase, so that can, metabolize this neurotransmitter. We don't get into enzymes at this point. We said these neurotransmitter, either they will be reuptaken, or they will diffuse away from that area, or they will be broken down into their precursor substance by the enzymatic action. By these three ways, the the uh, the action of the neurotransmitter will be stopped. Okay. Now, another thing can happen, that is, that is, there are some receptors in the presynaptic terminal as well. Okay, there are some receptors in the presynaptic membrane. The sum of the neurotransmitter can bind to the presynaptic receptors present in the presynaptic membrane, and they can modulate the further release or stop of release of the neurotransmitter. Okay, for an example, if you have enough here, so some of the neurotransmitter will bind to the receptors, and they will inhibit the further release of neurotransmitter from the presynaptic membrane. Okay, now if we summarize the events again, on the first thing is, the precursor substance will enter the presynaptic terminal, and by the enzymatic action, they will synthesize neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters will remain stored into the presynaptic vesicles. Now, when a signal comes here, it will depolarize the membrane. In response, the calcium ion will go in, and that will cause the neurotransmitter containing vesicles to bind to the presynaptic membrane. And the next step, the neurotransmitter present in the synaptic vesicle will be released into the synaptic cleft by the process of exocytosis. Those released neurotransmitter will bind to the receptors present in the postsynaptic membrane, and they will elicit response. Now, response will depend on what type of neurotransmitter is being released, right? Now, after the action is done, after the response is produced in the postsynaptic membrane, we don't want this response to last for a long time. So then this neurotransmitter need to be removed from this area. So what are the ways they can be removed? One is some of the neurotransmitter can go back into the presynaptic membrane in terminal. Some of them can diffuse away from the site, or some of them can be metabolized. By these three ways, their action is terminated. Now, one final event is some of the neurotransmitter may bind to the receptors present in the presynaptic membrane, and that can modulate the further release of neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. Okay, so that completes the process of synaptic transmission. Do you have any question? You can keep your mics on, and you can interrupt me whenever you need to ask me anything. Do you have any question from synaptic transmission? Go ahead.
Yes. And the post-synaptic response, is the response due to the specific neurotransmitter, or is it due to the cell type that the receptor is on?
Yes, good. Both of them are correct, actually, because depending on the cell, it will contain the specific receptors, right? So if when you bind to the receptor, some of the receptor, when you bind, okay, now eventually it's a movement of ions, right? Now, if your postsynaptic membrane have receptors that can open, when they are activated, they can open the receptor or ligand gated sodium channels. So they will open sodium channels, so the membrane will be depolarized, right? If the membrane is depolarized, so the signal will continue to travel. Now, if you stimulate a receptor that open the potassium channel, if the potassium start going out, or chloride channel, the chloride goes in. If the chloride goes inside the membrane, what will happen to the membrane? Membrane is already polarized. It will be further polarized. So no, forward transmission of the signal, right? Or if the potassium channels are open instead of sodium, the potassium will move out. That will further polarize the membrane, right? Now, you are correct on both sense. Now, depending on the type of neuron, it will contain the neurotransmitters. And also, depending on the postsynaptic cell, it depends on what type of receptor postsynaptic cell is having, because not all the postsynaptic membrane will have all sorts of receptors. It will have a receptor specifically for this type of what type of neurotransmitter is coming. So whether the signal will go forward or not, it will depend, for sure, it will depend on the type of neurotransmitter. Now, what type of neurotransmitter is being released will depend on what type of neuron it is. If it is a cholinergic neuron, it will release the acetylcholine. If it is an adrenergic neuron, it will release norepinephrine. If it is an excitatory neuron, it will stimulate the it will release the excitatory neurotransmitter. If it is an inhibitory interneuron, it will release neurotransmitter that will inhibit the further transmission of signal, right? So at the end, what you said is correct. It depends on the cell type. So depending on the cell type, that will determine what type of neurotransmitter will be released in that synapse and what type of postsynaptic receptors you have on your postsynaptic membrane. Okay. Anybody else have any question? No? If not, then we can move forward. Now, membrane potential. Membrane potential is something, this is a very important concept in neuroscience. I'm not sure how familiar are you with the term, the membrane potential, but I want to go into, this is a very important concept. If we can understand the membrane potential, then to understand action potential will not be a problem at all. That should be very simple and straightforward. So let's have an idea how the membrane potential is generated, or resting membrane potential is generated. Then we'll go further on how an action potential is generated. Okay. Now, this is a simple, like two electrode situation. So if you place an electrode inside the cell, this is the cell membrane. So this is the interior of the cell. This is outside the cell. If you place a reference electrode on the outside of the extracellular fluid outside the cell and put a electrode inside the cell, and you measure the current, then you will see the inside of the cell is minus 80 millivolt negative compared to outside. Okay. So this membrane potential, which is negative inside the cell compared to outside, and at rest when the cell is not stimulated, this is called the resting membrane potential. Potential difference across the cell membrane at rest. Now, which cell will have resting membrane potential? Almost all cells of the body will have a resting membrane potential, which means when the cells are not stimulated, the inside of the cell will be negative compared to outside. Now, how much negative? That will depend on what type of cell you are talking about. If you are talking about large muscle fiber or a large nerve fiber, it will be about minus 90 millivolt. Okay. If you look at a small nerve fiber, maybe it is a little less, maybe 70 millivolt, minus 70 millivolt or minus 60 millivolt, something like that. If you look at the SA node, do you know the heart has its own pacemaker, right, to generate pace? If you see the membrane potential on the SA node, that is much less negative, which is about 55 millivolt. So anyway, whatever cell you try, inside of the cell will be negative compared to outside, and when that you will see that it is at rest. When the cell is not stimulated, it is at rest. inside of the cell is negative compared to outside. How do we know that? We can do a simple test. We can place an electrode inside, a reference electrode outside, we see the potential difference. Okay, so this one is giving us a minus 80. It can vary from, as I said, from minus 55 to minus 90. Okay, now first thing is that why it is so. Why the inside of the cell is negative compared to outside. Now, what are the mechanism involved in that? So if we can understand this concept, the rest of the thing will be very easy for us. Okay. Now, those of you already know it, it's okay. If it's just to remind me if I say anything which is not right, or those who are not familiar with this concept, be just carefully follow me, see if we can, clarify these things. So now, if I look at a cell here, a hypothetical cell, okay, let me, oh, no. Let me draw something. Okay. So if I, ignore my drawing, so they will be pretty bad. So, okay, so like this, if this is a cell, and this is the nucleus inside the cell, okay? Now, this is a hypothetical cell. This is not a typical cell, okay? But all the cells in our body have a channel for movement of the ion. We call it sodium-potassium pump. If you are familiar with it, it's wonderful. If you are not, then you need to look carefully. So the sodium-potassium pump, which means what? From the name we know it will exchange, it will pump sodium and potassium, right? Now, which direction it will pump, that is very important. So this pump will pump sodium outside, okay? When this pump work, it will pump sodium out, okay? And it will pump potassium in. That make it a sodium potassium pump, right? Because it is pumping sodium and potassium. Now, this is an energy requiring process. When we say pump, we mean it's an active transport. Are you familiar with the active transport, passive diffusion, those terms? Good. So sodium potassium pump is an active transport, which means for this sodium potassium pump to operate, you need to have, the energy is required. And when we are at rest, 25% of our energy expenditure is for the sodium potassium pump. So that it is that important. Okay. So what happens as the pump, who will provide energy? ATP will be converted into ADP, which means a high energy phosphate will be released that will provide energy for sodium potassium pump. Now, if the pump continue to operate, what will happen? More sodium potassium will be inside the cell and more sodium will be outside the cell. That's why if you look at the intracellular sodium, you see very low intracellular sodium compared to extracellular sodium. If you look at potassium, you will see intracellular potassium is very high compared to, compared to extracellular potassium. So who is maintaining this high concentration of potassium inside the cell and high concentration of sodium outside the cell? And that is sodium potassium pump is primarily responsible for that. Okay, is this much clear? It's a pump pumping sodium out, potassium in. As a result, potassium will be concentrated inside the cell, sodium will be concentrated outside the cell. So concentration gradient wise, they are not equal inside and outside, way different. Okay, that is one thing. Number two important thing that we have to remember, when this pump operates, we call it an electrogenic pump. It's not electroneutral. If the pump push out or pump out 2 sodium and bring 2 potassium in, there will be no net change in electrical charge, right? Because 2 positive charges are coming out, 2 positive charges are going in, which means as long this pump is operating, there will be no difference in electrical potential in the cell, right? But we say this is an electrogenic pump. If the pump continue to work, it will modify the potential. Okay. So now if we look at the pump carefully, what it will do, it will pump 3 sodium out in exchange of 2 potassium in. Okay. So every time the pump operates, it is pumping 3 positive out and it is taking 2 positive in. So if the pump continue to operate, what will happen to inside of the cell? Inside of the cell will become more negative or inside of the cell will become more positive? You speak out. We need to understand every step of it, okay? Number one is sodium is going out, potassium is going in. That making potassium highly concentrated inside the cell and keeping sodium outside the cell. The next point we said, this pump, it pump every time it pump 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in. If the pump keep operating, what will happen to the net charge between inside and outside of the cell? Cell is losing positive, right? Because it is losing 3 positive in exchange of 2, which means the more the pump work, the more negative inside the cell will be, right? Okay, so now as the pump operates, it make the inside of the cell about 5 millivolt, okay? Oh, this is taking time. 5 millivolt. As the sodium potassium pump keep working, it keep the inside the cell minus 5 millivolt. Okay, so are we done with sodium potassium pump? Do you have any question about sodium potassium pump? I want to make sure that we understand every single step of it, so that when we talk about action potential, we'll go quickly. We'll not spend too much time. So you are clear on this one, right? It is a active pump requiring energy, and it is an electrogenic pump. It will create potential difference across the cell membrane. Okay, now this hypothetical cell, let's say this is cell number 1. Okay, cell number 1. This cell, if we say it is a hypothetical cell and it has some other opening as well, and say if this cell is permeable, if the cell membrane is permeable only to potassium ion. A normal cell will not have permeability only to potassium. It will have permeability to potassium, sodium, chloride, calcium, everything. But this is a hypothetical cell, we said. So we say this cell is permeable only to potassium. Now, if this one is permeable to potassium, and it's always open, we call it leak channel. So they can, the ion can move through them at any point. Now, if it is a channel that allow only potassium, which direction, think of concentration gradient, which direction potassium will move, inside to outside or outside to inside?
Inside to outside.
Inside to outside, why?
You'll have a higher concentration of
Wonderful, wonderful. That's
potassium.
what I wanted to know. We have already high concentration of potassium inside compared to outside, right? Outside is about 10 millimole, inside is about 150 millimole, so way high inside. So concentration gradient will pump the potassium out, right? Will pump potassium out if it is permeable. Now, it is not only the concentration gradient that will determine how much potassium or sodium is going in and out. Another factor that will be important here, which is the electrical potential. Now, forget about concentration. If it is only dependent on electrical potential, which way potassium should move? You see, my inside is negative. Potassium is a positive charge. Now, if the potassium go out, that will create even more negativity inside, right? So electrical potential will try to bring potassium in, right? Through the same channel. Now, so I have now two forces. One is electrical force that is pulling in potassium, and the concentration gradient that is pumping potassium out. Are you with me? Good. Now, so if we see the way the cell membrane operates, we see the concentration gradient will have the upper hand at this point, okay? The driving force of the concentration gradient is way more than the electrical force that is trying to bring potassium in. So the concentration gradient, chemical gradient, that will be the predominant force. If that is the predominant force, potassium will keep going out, right? Now, if potassium is moving out through this leak channel, what will happen to the inside of the cell in terms of electricity? It will become more negative, right? Because cell is losing more positive. So the inside will become more positive. Now, as it continues, it become more positive, more negative, more and more negative. And then at one point, it becomes so much negative inside, then now the electrical potential that is pulling potassium in and the concentration gradient that is trying to push potassium out, they will reach an equilibrium. Okay, so at what potential this equilibrium will be reached? It will be about when the cell become minus 90 millivolt, that equilibrium will be reached. At this point, when the inside of the cell become minus 90 millivolt, okay, when the inside of the cell become minus, or say like minus 80 millivolt, whichever, or 85, depending on which cell you are talking about. If the cell become minus 80 millivolt, now the electrical force that is trying to pull potassium in and the concentration gradient that is trying to push potassium out, though there will be equilibrium reached between those two. Now they are equal force. One is pulling in, one is pumping out. They become equal. Inward force and outward force become equal. So when the inward force and outward force become equal, will there be any net movement of potassium at this point? No, because inward and outward forces are equalized now. Okay, at that potential, we call that equilibrium potential for that particular ion. So what is the equilibrium potential for potassium ion? Is minus 85. What does it mean? When the inside of the cell become minus 85 compared to outside, no net movement of potassium will take place through the potassium leak channels. Did you get that? Okay. This is absolutely important. We have to be very, this is not complicated. It's simple. Just think of potassium is a positive charge, sodium is a positive charge, and inside the cell is negative compared to outside. Okay. Now, what is the what is the resting membrane potential of the cell 1 is minus 90, right? Okay. So now of the minus 90, minus 85 is contributed by potassium and minus 5 is contributed by the sodium potassium pump, right? Okay. Now let's draw another cell, another hypothetical cell. Oh, this cell is even worse. It's okay. Never mind. So this is the nucleus, right? And again, this one will have a sodium potassium pump, right? Now, sodium potassium pump will create a negativity, which is minus 5 millivolt, right? Minus 5 millivolt. Okay, minus 5. Okay, now this hypothetical cell is different. We say this hypothetical cell have a channel which allow only sodium to move. It doesn't have any potassium channel. It has only sodium channel. Now, if the channel allows sodium to move, which direction sodium will be moving? Think of concentration gradient at this point, just concentration. Which direction sodium ion will move? You have to tell me. This is
inside.
Sodium will move. Wonderful. So you don't have to be shy. You can say, if you're wrong, that's okay. So sodium will move inside. Why sodium will move inside? Because sodium concentration is way high outside than inside. So along the concentration gradient, sodium will move inside, right? Now, which direction, if we think of electrical gradient, which direction sodium will move on this cell? Which direction will sodium move? Please answer.
Outside.
Outside. It will move out.
Go
Would
ahead.
it not move back in still?
So you see, okay, so one said in, one said out. Let me explain it. The one who said sodium will move in, okay, because you see inside is negative.
Mhm.
So if the sodium move in, it will help the neutralize the negativity that you have in, right? So because inside is negative compared to outside, positive charge will tend to move in. That is the natural tendency, right? Because if you keep pumping sodium out, it's already negative, it will become more negative. So electrical potential is also towards inside. Now the sodium will move in along the concentration gradient, also along the electrical gradient, right? Now, after some sodium move, this electrical potential will disappear. Minus 5 will become at some point 0. When it becomes 0, now electrical potential is not there anymore, but we still have concentration gradient that is pumping sodium in. That is, the diffusing. Because of that, sodium is still diffusing in, right? Now, as the sodium keep moving in, inside of the cell will now become positive, right? So say like at some point, after, because of the movement of sodium, inside of the cell become plus 60 millivolt. Okay. So now if the inside of the cell is plus 60 millivolt, the constant electrical gradient will not help sodium moving in anymore, right? Because already inside is already too positive. Why should I bring more positive? So electrical potential will not do anything, but outside have so much sodium that it will try to still keep pushing sodium in. But like potassium, on this cell as well, at certain point, now in this case, electrical force will try to move sodium out. Concentration is trying to bring sodium in. So when the cell reaches plus 60 millivolt, a equilibrium will be attained where there will be balance between the electrical force that is trying to push sodium out and a concentration chemical gradient that is trying to bring sodium in. Okay, so there will be an equilibrium. So what will be this equilibrium? This is plus, say, like 65. Okay, so this one is achieved by only diffusion of sodium, right? Potassium doesn't have any contribution here, and this one sodium doesn't have any contribution here. Now we call this one equilibrium potential for potassium, and this is the equilibrium potential for sodium. Okay. Now, if we look at our resting membrane potential, which is resting membrane potential is minus 90, right? Say like minus 90. So resting membrane potential is close to this one or close to this one? Cell number 1, right? Cell number 1 is close to resting membrane potential, which means, what does it mean? It means that under resting condition, the diffusion of potassium is more important in determining the resting membrane potential. It's not sodium. If it is sodium, then inside of the cell would have been positive compared to outside. So did you get that? Okay. So which means a normal cell, a cell is more permeable to potassium than sodium. Okay. Normally, that's why resting membrane potential is close to potassium equilibrium potential, right? Now, if we say it is mainly the potassium that is determining the membrane potential, resting membrane potential, then what is the role of sodium potassium pump? In terms of value, the role is very small, right? Minus 5 compared to minus 85. So potassium is doing the job. Diffusion of potassium through the potassium leak channel is doing the most important job, right? In terms of number. But if you think of sodium potassium pump, if you don't have sodium potassium pump operating, cell will not concentrate potassium in and keep sodium out. If you cannot do that, cell cannot maintain its resting membrane potential. So did you get that? Even though direct contribution of sodium potassium pump is not much, but indirectly that has a very, very significant role, because operation of sodium potassium pump is the vital factor that is concentrating potassium inside the cell and keeping sodium outside the cell. And because of that, ion can move through the leak channels. Okay, now if you diminish, if this one stop working, if on this stop working, there will be not much potassium inside the cell. So if the potassium is inside and outside become equal, can potassium go out to make the cell more negative? It cannot. So the basis of the resting membrane potential is created by sodium potassium pump, even though its direct contribution in actual voltage, actual current is not much. Did you get that? Are you okay? If not, don't hesitate to ask. If I had to explain it 10 times, 20 times, I will rather do it. Then you are just not very sure. Just be absolutely certain about this thing, okay? So, okay. Okay. So now, how do we, you see, we don't always use this the electrodes inside and outside of the cell to count it, right? What we do, there are established equations or established formulas which we will use to calculate the membrane potential. So like one such one is called Nernst equation. Okay, this is the Nernst equation. Membrane potential is, this is actually E0, which is standard potential of the cell and then there are several numbers that you don't have to memorize it. Just RT by ZF log 10 of any ion outside by inside. Okay, so if you put the number of sodium in out and sodium in, then you can calculate what is the equilibrium potential of the sodium is, right? Now here, these things are important. R is actually the gas constant. T is temperature. Now let me tell you something about temperature. This temperature is not the regular temperature like room temperature of 37, or we want to carry the experiment at at 25. This temperature is in Kelvin. So to get a Kelvin temperature or absolute temperature, whatever the temperature is in your experimental condition, you have to add 273 to it. So temperature here, they put 298, which means this experiment was done at a temperature of 25. 25 plus 273, that become 298. This is not 298 degrees centigrade or Fahrenheit. It's in Kelvin, okay? So that is something important. R is the gas constant, T is the Kelvin temperature, Z is the valency. So for sodium, it will be 1. For potassium, it will be 1. For chloride is negative, so it will be -1, right? It's like that. And then log 10 of, you put the number sodium in and sodium out, then it will give a value of about 63.98 millivolt. It's a plus, okay? Now, if we simplify the calculation for a positive, if you do it at a 37 degrees, you can just, simplify the equation into 61.5 log ion out by ion in. So you can put value of any ion in and out, and you can calculate the equilibrium potential for that particular ion. This is not the membrane potential. This is the equilibrium potential of one particular ion if a hypothetical cell is permeable to only that particular ion. Okay? So think about it carefully. And so we also sometimes call it Nernst potential. What is the Nernst potential for potassium? That is actually equilibrium potential for potassium. What is the Nernst potential for sodium? We say this is the equilibrium potential for sodium. Okay. And G is the valency and F is the Faraday's constant. These are all constant number. You can put those numbers. Just to simplify it, you can just use this formula, okay, to calculate Nernst potential or the equilibrium potential of a particular ion. Now, we are talking about one particular ion, right? But we don't have any cell in the body which is only permeable to sodium or only permeable to potassium. We don't have that. So our cells are normally have, maybe it has more permeability to potassium, less permeability to sodium, more to calcium, less to chloride, but cell membrane is permeable to several ions. Now, this one can give us a calculation where cell membrane is permeable to only one particular ion. That is not actually the case, right? So to do that, so to calculate the membrane potential of a cell which is permeable to several ions, this is the equation we used. All you need to know, you don't have to memorize it. Just remember that we use Nernst equation can calculate the membrane potential, equilibrium potential of one particular ion. But to calculate the membrane potential of a membrane which is permeable to several ions, we use Goldman-Hodgkin-Kurtz equation. Okay, now this equation is like this. What are the important things here? This pK is the permeability of potassium, okay, and this is potassium out by potassium in. PNA is the permeability of the membrane to sodium, and PCl is the permeability of the membrane to chloride. Okay, and then you put the value concentration of potassium outside by inside, outside by inside. Look for chloride, it's a inside by outside, it's reversed because chloride is negative, right? It's -1, negative valency. So that's why it's inside by outside, not outside by inside for positive, and inside by outside for negative ion. So now it is simplified. So if you put this log into all these values, you can measure the membrane potential for a cell, okay, any particular cell. Now look at the concentration difference. Sodium is, potassium outside is 10, inside is 150. Look at the concentration gradient, huge concentration gradient. Similarly for sodium, its outside is 140, the inside is just 15. So sodium will always tend to move in. If you allow sodium to move, they will always move in. Okay. So let's move quickly. Now, action potential. We said the cell has a resting membrane potential. Now, if it is an excitable cell and you apply an appropriate stimulus, what will happen? It will gradually go up. Actually, these are localized potential will be formed. Now, every cell has a threshold for excitation. This is the about, even though resting membrane potential is -90, at -65, this cell, this neuron will, that is its threshold. When you reach the threshold, now if you apply a small stimulus and it become like this, -90 to -80, it will not create any action potential. To create an action potential, your localized potential should reach at this level. This is called threshold for excitation. When you reach the threshold for excitation, at this point, the voltage gated sodium channels will open. Now, if the voltage gated sodium channel open, which direction sodium will move? Outside to inside or inside to outside? Are you not sure? Where we have more sodium, outside or inside?
On the outside.
On the outside. So if we open the sodium channel, which direction sodium will move? Sodium is diffusing, right? They will
Yes.
diffuse from outside to the inside. So if a lot of sodium move through the voltage gated channel from outside to inside, what will happen to the potential inside? Potential will go towards the positive, right? So now it was -90. When it come here, it completely lose its polarity. It's 0 now. It doesn't stop even at 0. It goes towards the positive direction, +35. Now, the voltage gated sodium channel will open only for a very short time, okay, for few milliseconds. Okay, now look at the 4 millisecond here. From here to here is about 1 millisecond. So at that point, sodium channel will be closed. Not only sodium channel will be closed, voltage gated potassium channel will be open now. Now, if the voltage gated potassium channel open, which way potassium will move? Potassium is more inside than outside, so potassium will move out. So when the potassium start moving out, cell will start losing its positive charge, so it will go back to its polarized state, right? So this phase, we are losing the polarity, we call depolarization. Here, we are regaining the polarity, so we call repolarization. So when it arrive here, we are completely repolarized, right? But potassium channel still keep moving some potassium out. So then not only it doesn't stop at resting membrane potential, it goes more negative than resting membrane potential. Already it's polarized, and it is, you are increasing its polarity. We say this cell is hyperpolarized. And then eventually, gradually, they will go back into a resting membrane potential. Okay, and then you can stimulate the cell again here. You can generate another action potential here. So these are the phases of action potential. Cell will be at rest when small stimulus, mechanical stimulus will reach the threshold for excitation. Voltage gated sodium channel will open. The membrane will quickly lose its polarity and it will go into the opposite direction. We call the membrane is, that membrane is depolarized. Now at that point, sodium channel will be closed, potassium channel will open, potassium will start going out, cell will be repolarized again. Now it doesn't stop exactly at the resting potential, it go further down below the resting membrane potential. We say this cell is hyperpolarized. Okay, hyperpolarized at this point. Okay, now quickly let me show you the status of the sodium channel, how it happened. So this is a normal resting cell. This cell is not stimulated. Okay, so you can see this is sodium channel. See, the channel is closed. You see, did you see it? The sodium channel is closed. Outside the cell is positive, inside is negative. The cell is at rest. Resting membrane potential -90. Inside is negative, outside is positive. Now, if I stimulate the cell, and if we can reach, okay, you cannot see this, right? Okay. Okay. Now, if I can stimulate the cell and my stimulation reaches threshold for excitation, what will happen? Look at the sodium channel. Here it was closed. Now look at it's open here. Okay. Now, when you open it, we have a lot of sodium outside. The sodium will quickly rush in through the open sodium channel. So the membrane will lose its polarity and it will go towards positive, like what we saw in the previous, the slide, right? Okay. Now we said it will not stay open like this for a long time. It will be closed. Sodium channel will be closed. So now what happened next step? What happened in the next step? Look at this one. Here sodium channel is closed. No sodium is coming in, but it is different than this one. Do you see any difference between this one is still open here? Okay, but their sodium has two gates. One is called the activation gate and this is called the inactivation gate. Normally, under normal circumstances, inactivation gate is not inactivated. This is open. But sodium cannot come in because your activation gate is closed. When you stimulate a cell, its activation gate is now open. So sodium is rushing in because we have a lot of sodium outside. Now, at the first thing what happened, how the sodium entry of sodium is blocked, not because this part is blocked, actually inactivation gate is closed. So you see this one is closed down. This is important. So do you see the difference between this one and this one? Okay, here activation gate is closed so that if you activate, you can open the activation gate and can have a response. But here inactivation gate is closed. Now, if you stimulate the cell here, can you get a response? No, because if you stimulate, activation gate will open. Activation gate is already open here. So if you stimulate this cell any further, you cannot get any more response because inactivation gate is closed. So that is a big difference between this state and this state, which means in this state, cell is excitable. In this state, cell is not excitable. In this state, we say the cell is in a refractory period. That is an absolutely important concept. Cell is in refractory period, which means no matter how big a stimulus you apply here, you cannot generate a response. Because why? Because cell cannot respond to a stimulus at this stage because sodium inactivation gate is now closed.
What causes the refractory period?
Refractory period is caused by the inactivation gate closure.
What causes that to close is what I meant more over.
Yeah, it's a relative voltage because this. Okay, so why we call this call this channel voltage gated? Because their gate is controlled by the voltage. Now, at this particular voltage, what is the voltage here? What is the membrane potential here? Inside is -90 compared to outside. At this voltage, activation gate of sodium is closed and inactivation is open. At this stage, activation gate still remain open, but inactivation gate is closed. These are all dependent on what is the potential. They are all, because we call them voltage gated sodium channels, right? So at this voltage, this will remain closed, this will open. At this voltage, see, this will still remain open, but sodium cannot get in because your inactivation gate is closed. Now, activation gate can be opened by stimulus. Inactivation gate, you cannot open it by stimulating. That's why when your inactivation gate is closed, if the cell is in that particular status, you cannot stimulate a cell. So in that condition, we call the cell to be in refractory period. Very important concept. Remember refractory period, okay? Here, refractory period. At this point, you cannot stimulate the cell. That's why, repeatedly stimulating a cell, you cannot generate response all the time. Like if we go here, okay, so if we look at this one here, okay, now if you see, you are stimulating the cell here, you are having a response, right? Now here sodium is still going in, right? Now here cell is absolutely refractory. You cannot, at this step, if you apply, no matter how strong a stimulus you apply here, you cannot generate a second action potential on this one, because cell is absolutely refractory, absolutely non-responsive. Okay, cell is non-responsive. Why the cell is not non-responsive? Because of the the orientation of this of the channel, because these channels are regulated by voltage, right? Now if you okay, so a refractory period, actually there are two types of refractory period. One refractory period is called absolute refractory period. The later part of the refractory period we call, okay, so the cell will be refractory from here to here, right? Say like from here to here. Now up to from here to here, no matter how big a stimulus you apply, cell will not respond, because cell doesn't have the capacity to respond. Now this part of the later part of the refractory period, this we call a relative refractory period, which means if you apply a larger stimulus, cell can respond by a small response, because cell is still refractory, but that refractory is not absolute, it's relative. Okay, now this one, so this is the position of the cell, where because this is the resting status, you apply stimulus, this closed one will be open. Now if you apply here, this is already open. What the stimulus will do? Stimulus cannot open any further. This is already open. But why you are not getting any response? Why sodium is not coming in? Why you are not getting any depolarization? Because sodium entry is blocked by the inactivation gate. Did you get it? One shot you may not get the whole thing, but it will take some time. Eventually it will sink in. So just take the, okay. Anyone have any question? Yeah, you can unmute and ask question if you have. Are you trying to ask any question? Anyone? This is, I believe, the last slide actually. So, okay. Okay, so I think that is the end of this one, and time is up as well. Oh, okay. So let me stop sharing the screen. How can I do that? Stop sharing the screen. Okay. Screen sharing is stopped. So it's 10 o'clock already. If anyone have to leave, you can leave. If you have any question, you can ask me, I will try to answer. If not, then we will talk about the autonomics in the next class. For those who are not familiar with the electrical conductance across the cell membrane, maybe a little difficult, but it's not complicated. You guys are graduate students, smart. Impossible, good. Impossible is nothing, right? Good, good. But did you in your course, in any course, did you learn the transport across the cell membrane? Simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport. You did, okay. So then it's fine. You should be okay. But as I said, if anything comes to your mind, don't hesitate to call me. And if you feel shy asking question in front of everybody, you can send me email. We can have one-on-one meeting if necessary. I will try whatever it takes actually from my end to make sure that your understanding is clear. So as I said, synaptic transmission should not be a problem because let me stop the recording.